I've seen things you people wouldn't believe.
Hello, I am Eshmira Yalas-Cephas, an arch-wizard of the Silver Circle, and a friend of Helios, who runs this show. Before that pestilent little fireball begins today's horror story, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel. Whilst I tease him, I can say he does love entertaining you whenever he can. And your support would mean the world to him. Thank you, and now on with the show.
Year-long campaign with an increasingly upsetting and batshit plot. So I just found this sub, and I'm excited to share the first of 2 RPG horror stories. 3 friends and I started playing Dungeon World in late 2019, shortly before the pandemic hit. This was especially unfortunate because the main story of the game was that there was a nasty plague sweeping the land. Not the GM's fault, but still a rough vibe from the start. It was a smaller group, me, the druid, the bard, an excellent player, the ranger, a not as excellent player. In session 0, we told the GM we wanted a zany adventure, something fantastical and wild. But when we started the game, we found ourselves in a desolate point-of-light setting on a snowy mountain. Lots of empty space, sparse and tiny towns, and literally no NPCs liked us, because we were outsiders. Our goal was to help these people with the plague affecting their land, but literally everyone we spoke to told us to kick rocks. Not exactly the fun, fantastical world we were expecting, but we went with it. At the start, we were introduced to these mysterious enemies with alabaster weapons. They were humanoid but didn't talk and moved weirdly and were described like zombified huntsmen. Their faces were covered, so no one really knew what they were. The one time we kinda tried to mess with them, they kicked our asses and we had to flee. This gave off big elite attack dogs of the BBEG vibes to me and seemed fairly important. We found a magical little girl who could see visions of the future and possibly had other powers. Her parents had been killed by the mysterious huntsman, so our party took her in. We really had no idea what to do with the child, though the GM wasn't giving us any hints. He was also playing her very true to life as a traumatized and broken-hearted child, so things were getting a little dark. He literally described her screaming through a mind-melting nightmare at one point. We also hired an NPC to help us out for a while, and later on, this hireling decided we weren't fit to be watching over this kid because of the dumb assery perpetuated by our ranger. He was not taking the plot seriously. The hireling threatened to leave with the child if the ranger didn't shape up his behavior, and the ranger pretty much laughed in her face, so she took the kid and left. So the entire plot hook we were working with had just gotten up and exited the story. Yeah, that ranger sounds like a prick. I can see the story already going downhill. By the way, the GM decided that the players could, or rather would, contract the plague, and we all had plague counters. Well, that's kind of interesting and fun. As our counters went up, we'd get sickness debuffs, but we could also get visions to help us solve the mystery of the sickness. This was an interesting mechanic, but the visions often didn't feel very useful. Also, he described all the gross stuff happening to our bodies in way too much detail. However, we were getting visions of white towers, and eventually we found one of these white towers. We realized a cult was operating out of it and seemed to be perpetuating the plague. Finally, we were making progress. It seemed plausible that the zombie huntsman might be operating out of the towers too. But no. Apparently the alabaster towers and the alabaster weapons were not related. This GM is not really good at tying ideas together, especially blatant ones like that, which became even more evident as time went on, and the huntsman just never made a reappearance, and were not mentioned ever again. Another interesting plot just deleted from the narrative. Yeah, I think a lot of creative types, sometimes they have this barrage of ideas and they just create heaps of threads that should be coming back together at the end of the story, but when you make too many ideas, it's harder to rein it all in. So this DM sounds like he's just over creative and doesn't know how to work in his spontaneous ideas. We did manage to raid the cult and discover they were baking bread that was full of plague and spreading it around intentionally. Okay. In an admittedly cool boss encounter, we defeated the goo amalgamation monster they were creating. They were throwing corpses into a massive, half-sentient, plague-ridden sourdough starter. What the hell? That's disgustingly awesome. There were other towers ostensibly doing the same thing, but at least we'd made a dent in things. Unfortunately, the game was about to take a turn. Okay, so how more crazier can this get? More sessions of wandering around later, we found a mad scientist who had somehow turned himself into a brain in a jar. This was possibly the first NPC we'd met who didn't hate us. He was comically friendly, while also being very likely evil, but at the moment he was conveniently harmless due to recent issues with his tech that stopped him from being able to pilot the little brain jar around. Weird pivot to suddenly have sci-fi tech in this fantasy world, but it was funny, so we rolled with it. And that's how all horror TTRPG stories go. You decide to roll with it and give the DM the benefit of the doubt. We did some quests with this guy in this old alchemy lab complex and found out the lab had dozens of dimensional doors in it, with very powerful entities trapped in pocket dimensions to be researched and experimented on. One of these doors had a biblically accurate angel behind it. The angel offered to make a pact with us, asking us to find its stolen flaming sword, which would give it the power to escape the pocket dimension. We would be rewarded highly, but if we failed, the world would be doomed somehow. Broken pacts with the angels were serious business, I guess. Despite these extremely high stakes, our ranger was just like, cool, sounds fun, sign me up. Later on, one of us actually had a vision giving us a big clue as to the location of the flaming sword. The GM really liked visions. Yeah, you can't half tell. But just a little while later, my druid somehow caused a wacky magical butterfly effect that extinguished the eternal flame on the sword, turning it into a completely normal, unmagical sword before we even found it. Yes, we learnt this information in another vision. Apparently, this didn't outright fail the quest, but I couldn't help wondering how on earth the GM expected us to fix that one. With yet another major threat looming over us, we eventually got betrayed by Brain in a Jar guy, and in the process he revealed that shortly before we arrived he had captured the bard's wife and child and turned them into brains in jars. Okay, maybe he's lonely. The GM was role-playing the wife and child in absolute existential horror, as they couldn't see, couldn't feel anything. They could communicate magically, but were perpetually terrified as they didn't actually know they were brains in jars. Oh god, this reminds me of the song One by Metallica. The bard had to break the news to them. Jesus Christ, I hated this part. Things accumulated with a fight on the roof of the laboratory. After we won, we tried to investigate a strange mechanism up there that seemed to control the weather somehow, but we couldn't understand how it worked or if it even could help us. This sounds like CERN. And now all the conspiracy theorists and their wacko ideas are just flooding back now, just spending hours on the internet reading people's insanity. Anyway, eventually we went back through the lab, intending to look for something to help the bard's debodied family members. Unfortunately, we immediately realized something was wrong, as everything looked different. The lab was dilapidated, and surrounding land was changed. The weather-changing device turned out to be a freaking time machine we had unknowingly used to fling ourselves centuries out of our time period, and now the mechanism wasn't working, so we couldn't go back. And apparently in this time period, there was an active war between humans and these gorilla gnoll things trying to massacre everyone. Okay, so this sounds like Back to the Future mixed with Planet of the Apes. Actually, no, this reminds me of Sliders. Sort of. At this point, we had no idea what to do. We defeated Brain Jar Guy, but he wasn't even a plot-related villain since he had absolutely nothing to do with the cult or sickness. We've contracted multiple levels of the plague, we have a ruined angel sword to locate and somehow fix, and we're pulling around these brain jars in a cart just praying that their jars won't get broken before we can bullshit some kind of solution for them. The fluids in the jar is the only thing keeping them alive, and the GM keeps mentioning the jars getting jolted and the fluids sloshing out bit by bit. Now we're in a different time period, and seemingly all the major plot points no longer even matter. The huntsman apparently never mattered, the magical little girl was gone and apparently irrelevant. We only ever found one evil bread tower out of I think 5 or 6, with limited clues about where the others even were. And now we're in the future facing a gnoll war. We try to carefully scope out the gnolls, but don't want to get involved in the war since we need to protect Mrs. Brain and Brain Jr. and try to find a way back to the past. But the GM railroaded us into getting completely sucked into the war, and we ended up leading an attack on the gnoll forces, which none of us actually wanted to do. This is where it all fell apart. The GM finally admitted that at some point he was no longer in the right mental space to run a campaign. Oh, you don't say. But he had been too scared to say anything, so he kept throwing random ideas at us and hoping we would make a game out of it. I thought they were going to say that he was hoping that they were going to quit. I respected him for finally admitting to this, but good grief, he put us through some of the most confusing, hopeless, frustrating content I've ever experienced in a tabletop game. Other small highlights included us being forced to leave the few NPCs who had ever supported us to die because of time travel, one of the bard's arms being encased in glass for multiple sessions for reasons I can't even remember, and the ranger growing tumours that talked to him when he was alone.
You have a brain tumor!
What in the where?
You have a tumor the size of a golf ball!
Every bad roll was punished with what felt like completely unsolvable, incredibly serious problems. The worst part is that the GM really did have some cool ideas, and the game could have been amazing with a lighter tone and a lot more follow-through on plot threads. Honestly, if anyone wants to steal the concept of a bread cult with an evil sourdough starter at the center, I think that idea was genuinely hilarious and would love for it to live on somewhere else where it can be better utilized. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'll write up my second less wacky but somehow even more frustrating RPG nightmare. Well, OP, yeah, I look forward to that. If you haven't already posted it up, I'm going to go back and see if you've uploaded it because it's been a few days since I read this one. And we'll leave it there. That was fun, and until next week, I'll see you later. Bye.